a black soldier just returned from deployment, ready to finally go home. But when he steps into the airport, everything changes. A racist gate agent singles him out without cause, humiliates him in front of others, and then just 7 minutes later, he's escorted off the flight. But what happens next? The airline didn't know he was the silent billionaire who owned the backbone of their tech infrastructure. One phone call, $4 billion in funding pulled. And that was just the beginning. What began as humiliation becomes a movement that shakes the entire aviation industry to its core. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like and subscribe. It was just an ordinary airport terminal on a Wednesday morning when Elias Ward stepped into the cool artificial light of Gate B17 at JFK. Dressed in charcoal jeans and a simple slate gray button-down, he looked like any successful middle-aged traveler. Comfortable loafers, a smart leather carry-on slung over one shoulder, and a calm, almost invisible presence. He was neither trying to impress nor to hide, just blend. Years of calculated humility had taught him that power need not always walk with a spotlight. The only hint of wealth was his watch, understated, slim, but unmistakably expensive, a gift to himself the day his first tech company crossed the billion-dollar mark. He arrived 2 hours early, as always. Early was a ritual, a kind of quiet protest against the world's chaos. As he found a seat near the window, he pulled out his phone, not to scroll aimlessly like most, but to review reports, cross-reference valuations, and track acquisitions. His mind moved like a chess grandmaster's, 5 steps ahead, rarely shaken. But there was something else beneath the numbers, something old. A feeling that never quite left, no matter how many digits his net worth reached. An awareness, sharpened by a lifetime of being observed differently. Not because he was wealthy, but because he was black. It started with the smallest moment. He noticed her first, a white-haired woman, perhaps in her 70s, struggling with a roller bag caught on the textured carpet near the gate. She looked up, flustered, her pale blue eyes scanning for help. Elias didn't hesitate. "May I?" he offered with a gentle smile. She nodded, relieved. In one fluid motion, he freed the wheel and lifted the bag forward with ease. "Airport carpets," he chuckled lightly. "Designed to humble us all." She patted his arm with grandmotherly warmth. "Such a gentleman," she said. "My grandson could learn a thing or two from you." It should have been an unremarkable exchange. But across the terminal, a man in a tailored navy suit adjusted his cufflinks and narrowed his eyes. His wife, equally manicured, pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll. They were the Carringtons, names he would learn later, but eyes he had seen all his life. The look was subtle, rehearsed. Suspicion in a suit. Privilege wrapped in pearls. The boarding call came. No reason had to be given. Just the words, "You're making others uncomfortable." No warning. No incident. Just the invocation of a vague discomfort that weighed more than his right to stay seated. He could have protested, demanded answers. But he'd done that before. And he knew that this version of the story would never be told accurately if he resisted. Cameras were already rising. A college student with braids lifted her phone quietly. So instead, he complied. The walk of shame. Head high. Eyes forward. Shoulders steel. That was the performance expected of him, and he delivered it flawlessly. But as soon as he stepped into the terminal, everything shifted. He stopped near a wide window overlooking the tarmac. His hand moved with precision to his phone. A single call. A quiet voice. "It's me. Pull the investment. All of it. Today." No emotion. No raised voice. Just consequences. The truth is, people like the Carringtons don't realize who they're sitting next to. They've never had to. The world has always tilted in their favor, so they don't imagine someone like Elias Ward, black, calm, impeccably dressed, could be the very person their industry depends on. They believe the systems they benefit from are built by people who look like them, who think like them, who serve them. But Elias had built something else. A network. A fortress in the shadows. While Aero Sky smiled for DI reports and printed glossy brochures with diversity front and center, they still treated black passengers in first class like anomalies. Like glitches in their imagined system. They didn't know Elias Ward was the system. So when they pushed him out of that seat, they weren't just embarrassing a man, they were lighting a fuse. One that had been laid carefully for decades. And now, for the first time, Elias allowed himself a small smile. Because sometimes, when the door closes behind you, it's not a defeat. It's the start of demolition. and he was ready to rebuild. As Elias stepped away from the gate, the sliding doors behind him sealed shut with a hiss, a sound he would later recognize not just as the closure of a flight he was unfairly removed from, but the final breath of an old system gasping to preserve itself. The security escort had left him near a row of polished chrome benches by the window, where the aircraft he'd been pushed off was now taxiing slowly onto the runway. He watched it with no expression. Not anger. Not pain. Just stillness. A stillness honed from decades of knowing what the world was capable of when it saw a black man who didn't flinch. He pulled his phone from his pocket, already knowing which number to dial. There were no second thoughts. The moment was too clean, too precise, like the sharp click of a master key turning in a lock. He spoke 5 words into the line. Pull the investment. All of it. What followed was silence. Not on the line, but in the air around him. The kind of silence that comes not from emptiness, but from intention. Neville Goddard once wrote, "Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled." And in that moment, Elias didn't just act from strategy. He acted from inner certainty, and embodied knowing that justice had already begun its slow, deliberate march. Not in courtrooms, not in Twitter hashtags, but in vibration, in the unseen, in the law of consciousness itself. He had not built his empire with noise. Ward Global Ventures was not some flashy tech startup scrambling for headlines. It was a web of influence, quietly laced through the veins of infrastructure, aviation, logistics, AI systems, data security. And central among its clients was Aero Sky, the very airline that now soared away with its future clipped. They had no idea they had evicted the man who underwrote their ascent. As the plane disappeared into the clouds, Elias finally stood. But he did not walk away. He walked inward. People often mistake dignity for silence, but Elias knew better. Silence, when powered by alignment and imagination, was the most articulate form of command. He thought of his mother's teachings, the long evenings studying while she returned exhausted from the hospital, the stories of injustice she never told with bitterness, only clarity. She never used the word manifestation, but her life was a testament to it. She raised a son not to survive the system, but to see through it. Inside that terminal, Elias became a man walking between worlds, the one he had been born into, and the one he had imagined so vividly it had no choice but to emerge. He did not believe in coincidence. He believed in correspondence. He believed, as Neville Goddard preached, that your external world always mirrors your internal state. So the question was never why this happened to him. The question was what part of the old system was begging to collapse, and who was finally ready to say, enough. In the hours that followed, as the video of his removal spread like wildfire across social media, as influencers and activists debated the ethics of flying while black, and as PR teams at Aero Sky scrambled to draft apologies without admitting liability, Elias remained calm. He wasn't chasing a narrative. He was the narrative. He knew the rules were never written for men like him. First class was never designed with his image in mind. Systems, like airlines, weren't just engines and steel. They were belief structures. Imagined hierarchies made real by repetition. And in that sense, he didn't just lose a seat on a plane. He had been expelled from a story he never truly belonged to. So he began writing a new one. Back in his Manhattan office, glass stretching endlessly over the city, Elias reviewed financial dashboards while his assistant Marlon slid a tablet toward him. The video had passed 2 million views. But Elias's attention was elsewhere. He was tracing the seams of a deeper pattern, the kind of pattern most people miss because it doesn't scream. It whispers. It shows up in hiring algorithms, in seat reassignments, in vague reports of aggressive behavior, in the quiet way privilege defends itself by calling black calmness a threat. Neville taught that imagining creates reality, not just individually but collectively. Elias understood this deeply. The world didn't just need a lawsuit. It needed a new imagination. And so he began imagining. He pictured terminals where passengers weren't scanned for suspicion, but welcomed with dignity. He envisioned airlines where first class wasn't a gatekeeper of whiteness, but a testament to merit, service, and equity. He saw training modules built not on fear and profiling, but on human-centered psychology. He didn't imagine revenge. He imagined replacement. It's easy to fight a man, harder to fight a vision. Elias had always believed the most radical thing a black man could do in America was to own the infrastructure. Not the billboard, not the brand, the back end, the pipes, the algorithms. And he did, quietly, systematically, until one day, when a single phone call could collapse an empire built on arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, remembering one night in college when he had scribbled a single quote from Neville on the back of a napkin during an all-night study session. Change your conception of yourself, and you will automatically change the world in which you live. He never threw that napkin away, because somewhere deep down he had always known he wasn't meant to fit inside their planes. He was meant to build his own. The cabin lights were dimmed now, the hum of the engine steady as Flight 2187 soared through the air without him. Inside, the seats where Elias Ward once sat remained filled, but something fundamental had shifted, though most of the passengers didn't know it yet. Had been both shield and sword. The world had taught him that visibility was a double-edged weapon. Wield it too early, and they'd try to cut you down. But wield it at the precise moment of collapse, and you become the story that rewrites all the others. What Aero Sky didn't realize was that Elias Ward had never actually boarded their plane. Not really. His body did, sure. But his essence, his awareness, his assumption, as Neville would call it, had always been elsewhere. He had assumed justice. He had assumed truth. And now, through what the world might call injustice, that assumption was finding its channel. Marlin pulled up the internal ledger of Ward Global Ventures. It was beautiful in its complexity, an unseen scaffolding behind over 60% of the airline industry's operational software. Booking systems, flight path algorithms, real-time safety diagnostics, technology so foundational, so deeply embedded, that even the CEOs of those airlines didn't realize they relied on code born from the mind of the man they had removed. Elias didn't just own equity. He owned the experience. He owned the quiet nervousness a pilot felt when their diagnostic screen blinked with a SKYYNC alert. He owned the moment a flight attendant checked an upgrade list built by his recommendation engine. He owned the confidence a mother had when booking a seat for her child, trusting that the aircraft was safe, because of systems his team had designed, tested, perfected. Aero Sky had removed him from a seat he built. It was poetic, and it was also perfectly timed. While Marlin coordinated the legal team, Elias sat alone in his study for a moment. In front of him, framed on the wall, was a single artifact, a bus ticket. Montgomery, Alabama, 1994. The year his mother refused to move to the back of the Greyhound. The year a stranger stood up for them. The year he first understood what Neville meant by feeling is the secret. That day, his mother hadn't fought because she thought she could win. She fought because she felt who she was. And in that assumption, reality eventually aligned. Elias placed his hand gently on the glass. He didn't mourn the moment on the plane. He honored it, because it had revealed what needed to be revealed. It had pulled the mask off a system too polished to be challenged by words alone. You don't change the world by begging it to see you. You change it by being the one who sees. And that's what Elias had always done. That night, across the country, Aero Sky's corporate office sat in chaos. PR teams drafted statements. Executives blamed interns. Emails flew like panicked birds in a burning forest. But none of them saw it clearly. They thought this was about a man. They didn't see the mirror. Because Elias's removal was not just a moment. It was a manifestation. A precise event drawn from the deepest truth in the room. That the airline, like many systems built in its image, was designed not for justice but for preservation. Not for equity, but for maintenance of power, cloaked in policy hidden behind SOPs. The twist wasn't that Elias had power. The twist was that he no longer needed permission to use it. He didn't demand reinstatement. He demanded transformation. By the time the sun rose, Aero Sky's stock had dipped 3%. Investors were whispering. Analysts were asking questions. But Elias wasn't watching numbers. He was scripting reality. Neville Goddard taught that we are all God, each of us creators, not of random chaos, but of chosen states. And Elias, in that truth, didn't see himself as a disruptor. He saw himself as a corrector, a man aligning outer circumstances to inner conviction. He didn't need to burn Aero Sky to the ground. He just needed to stop fueling it, and that was already in motion. They had removed him from the plane. But in doing so, they gave him something far greater. Proof. Proof that what he had felt all along, that the illusion of progress was just that, illusion was real. And that proof would be the foundation for a system not based on fear, but one built on clarity, accountability, and imagination. Not the kind that dreams of flying, but the kind that dares to ask, what if we built an airline that didn't need to apologize for who it let sit in 3A? Elias closed his laptop, walked to the window, and watched as the sky turned pale with morning. The new day had arrived. And this time, he wouldn't be boarding someone else's plane. He was building his own. The morning light cut through the glass of Elias Ward's penthouse like truth through illusion, soft, relentless, unbending. He stood by the window, black coffee in one hand. The skyline of Manhattan sprawled before him like a chessboard he'd already won. But Elias wasn't celebrating. He wasn't angry either. He was still. Not still like silence. Still like certainty. Like a man who no longer needed the world's permission to make his move. The world was waking up to the story. Black man removed from flight, later revealed as billionaire tech investor behind Airline's core systems. It was the kind of headline that made people stop mid-scroll. But Elias wasn't reading headlines. He was reading patterns. He understood something few ever did: outrage fades. Memory is short, but infrastructure, that's eternal. This wasn't about going viral. This was about velocity, the unseen kind. The shift in consciousness that doesn't scream, but moves mountains anyway. Neville Goddard had a name for this: living in the end. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, Neville wrote. Remain faithful to it, and reality will mold itself to your inner conviction. Elias wasn't reacting to being removed from a plane. He was stepping into the reality he had already imagined long before that day. A reality where discriminatory systems collapse, not from protest alone, but from irrelevance. For the first time in a long time, he opened the drawer beneath his desk. Inside, carefully preserved in a simple black frame, was the rejection letter. Aero Sky Airlines, June 2008. Mr. Ward, thank you for your application. While your credentials are impressive, we feel your background does not align with our current team culture. Signed, Victor Langford, Director of Engineering, Aero Sky. He remembered the moment he got that letter. Fresh out of MIT, hungry, brilliant, naive. He had built the perfect resume. He had nailed the interviews. And still the door had closed. Not because he wasn't qualified, but because he didn't look like the kind of person they wanted in the cockpit of creation. That letter wasn't a rejection. It was a revelation. And now, 17 years later, Elias finally saw the full circle. The same man who shut the door on him was now the CEO of the company that dragged him off a plane. It would have been easy to call it karma, but Elias didn't believe in karma. He believed in consciousness, the kind that shapes timelines, the kind that moves silently beneath the surface of events and reemerges as destiny. Marlon entered the room without knocking. He never needed to. They've made a statement, he said. Vague. Empty. Full of words like protocol and passenger safety. But no apology. Elias took another sip of his coffee, unbothered. They're playing chess without realizing I already flipped the board. Marlon smiled at that, but only briefly. Our analysts estimate a 6% stock drop by end of day. Could hit 12% if we move the rest of the capital today. Elias nodded. Move it. He turned back toward the window. This was never about destruction for destruction's sake. It was about consequence. A cause. An effect. A system rooted in racism had treated dignity like a variable, and now it was watching its foundation shake because someone had dared to feel, think, and act as if it no longer had power. Neville Goddard taught that the world outside is nothing but a reflection of the world within. Elias had lived that truth for decades. While others focused on making it, he had focused on being it, being the man who no longer needed validation, being the architect who didn't ask for a blueprint. He built one. In the corner of the room, the large screen blinked on automatically, set to financial news. The anchor was nearly breathless. And in a shocking turn, sources have confirmed that the man removed from the flight is Elias Ward, founder of Ward Global Ventures. The firm reportedly holds controlling interest in SKYYNC Technologies, the backbone of Aero Sky's operational systems. The anchor's voice faltered as the numbers crawled across the screen. Aero Sky, 7.2% Ward Global, plus 3.6%, but Elias didn't watch the numbers. He watched the tone, the shift. The way people were beginning to realize that wealth wasn't just in bank accounts. It was in silence. It was in sovereignty. He opened his laptop. The screen displayed a list of emails and flagged documents. His legal team had already gathered all 8 prior discrimination settlements Aero Sky had buried under NDAs. Each one a brick in the wall they built to protect themselves. But Elias didn't want to tear the wall down. He wanted to dismantle it brick by brick and use it to build something else. The phone buzzed. Marlon answered, then handed it to Elias. It's Ava Grayson, he said. She's ready to talk. Ava, the compliance officer who tried to raise concerns 3 years ago about racial profiling in passenger removals. She had been silenced, pushed out, blackballed. Now she was part of the equation again. As Elias spoke to her, measured, respectful, curious, he could feel the future writing itself. Ava wasn't just a whistleblower. She was a builder, a systems thinker, a woman who had tried to speak truth in a place that punished integrity. Do you believe the system can be reformed? Elias asked her. There was a pause. Then, no, she said, but I believe it can be replaced. And that was all he needed to hear. Later that evening, Elias returned to his private study and opened a blank document. The header read, New Sky. He didn't need to know how it would all unfold yet. He didn't need a roadmap. He only needed the state, the assumption, the knowing, the feeling of passengers boarding a plane where dignity wasn't a privilege, where employees weren't trained to profile, but to protect, where the culture wasn't about risk management, but about human elevation. He closed his eyes and felt the reality of it. He imagined a mother, black or brown, flying with her child unworried. He imagined a pilot, formerly passed over, now welcomed, trusted, valued. He imagined a gate agent apologizing, not out of legal fear, but from shared humanity. He felt it all, as if it were happening now. Because, in his mind, it already was. Neville Goddard said, "Do not wait for facts to confirm your assumption. Make your assumption now and live by it." And so Elias did. Not tomorrow. Not when the media shifted. Not when the lawsuits hit. Now, in a world where they had stolen his seat, he took the entire cockpit. Not to control it, but to redesign the sky. The press was losing its mind. Screens flickered across every news station in America, anchors struggling to keep pace with the story that was no longer just a headline. It had become a reckoning. Financial analysts whispered about the Ward effect as if it were a market force. But Elias Ward wasn't watching the noise. He was moving within the silence between it. By midday, Aero Sky's market value had shed nearly 12%, and that was only the beginning. Emails were leaking. Executives were ghosting meetings. Shareholders were panicking. The ones who had once smirked at DI training now begged their PR teams to find words like accountability and empathy and inject them into official statements like adrenaline into a failing heart. But Elias wasn't after words. He was after alignment. He understood something fundamental that they didn't, that systems don't collapse under pressure, they collapse under exposure. What happened on Flight 2187 wasn't an incident. It was a rupture. The airline hadn't just ejected a man from his seat. They had exhaled a truth they could no longer hide. They never expected to be held accountable by someone with power. And now, that someone had a name, a voice, that his background didn't match their culture. The culture they meant, of course, was fear disguised as professionalism. It was gatekeeping wrapped in protocol. It was racism too polite to speak its name. And now the culture itself was eroding. Elias had called Ava the night before, not just to offer her a consulting role, but to tell her something no one else had. I believe you. And those 3 words changed everything. Because when you believe someone's truth, you don't just acknowledge their story. You align with the assumption of their reality. And that's where the real power lies. Neville Goddard knew this intimately. Feeling is the secret, he said. Elias had never forgotten that. Not when his teachers dismissed his curiosity in high school. Not when VC firms ignored his pitches until they saw his quarterly returns. Not when security guards, time and again, asked if he was in the right section of the airport lounge. He had felt his truth so deeply, so vividly, that the world had no choice but to catch up. And it was catching up fast. Across the city, inside Aero Sky's sleek corporate tower, chaos festered beneath glass and steel. The CEO, Victor Langford, still didn't understand the scale of what was unfolding. He thought a PR statement would fix it. He thought if they just found the right scapegoat, perhaps the flight attendant, perhaps a low-level operations manager, it would all pass. But there was no one left to throw under the plane. Because Elias hadn't started a fight. He had ended a cycle. When news leaked that Ward Global Ventures had withdrawn $4 billion in funding and revoked licensing from all Aero Sky operations, other CEOs took notice. Airlines, logistics firms, tech providers. No one wanted to be next. Because for the first time, discrimination didn't just come with outrage. It came with consequence. Back at Ward Global, the legal team reviewed 8 prior settlements filed against Aero Sky. Elias flipped through the files silently, recognizing the patterns not just in policy, but in perception. Every case included language like failure to follow crew instructions and disruption of service. But the reality was always simpler. Someone had made a white passenger uncomfortable, and that discomfort had been treated like a bomb threat. Now the real threat was exposure. Elias stood by the window again, watching the sunset dip below the skyline. 100 stories below, the city throbbed with motion. Drivers, delivery vans, pedestrians rushing through lives that had no idea they were standing on a tectonic plate he had just begun to shift. He wasn't angry. He wasn't triumphant. He was aligned. Neville Goddard said, "There is no fiction. If something can be imagined, it can be created." And Elias had imagined this day for years. Not in detail, but in essence. The feeling of it, the knowing, the sensation that the story would not end with a headline, but with a doorway. And now he had found it. Tomorrow, he would unveil the plans for something new. A reimagined aviation system. An airline built not on exclusion, but on equity. Where pilots, passengers, and crew alike could expect safety, not just from turbulence, but from systemic bias. Not a dream, a decision, a state. As night fell, Elias returned to his private terminal at the downtown helipad, where his team was preparing to meet with former Aero Sky employees, many of them people of color who had been pushed out quietly, their contributions erased. Tonight, that erasure would end. Not because Elias demanded recognition, but because he had assumed a higher truth, that dignity is not granted. It is claimed, and when claimed fully, without fear, without apology, it changes not just the man who claims it, it changes the world around him. The storm had reached its crescendo, but Elias Ward stood at its center untouched, calm, intentional, and unmoved. While the world chased headlines and social media churned with outrage and praise in equal measure, Elias remained grounded in something deeper than applause or anger. He had already stepped into the next chapter long before the first chapter ever became public. Because as Neville Goddard taught, to be transformed, the whole basis of your thoughts must change. But your thoughts cannot change unless you have new ideas, for every idea is only an expression of a desire. And Elias's desire was not destruction. It was recreation. The morning after Aero Sky's boardroom was thrown into chaos over evaporating stock prices and system revocations, Elias met with his core team in a private hangar on the outskirts of the city. It was quiet there, no cameras, no reporters, just the sound of intent sharpening itself into action. Ava Grayson sat beside him, her expression somewhere between determination and awe. The same company that had blackballed her into corporate exile was now unraveling because someone like her had refused to forget. And Elias, unlike the executives who discarded her, had called her back not to remember pain, but to build power. New Sky Airways, he said, revealing a sleek digital mock-up on a screen. The logo was simple, clean, and aspirational. But it wasn't the aesthetics that made Ava's breath catch. It was the blueprint behind it. "We're not just launching a new airline," Elias said. "We're setting a new standard. From hiring to routing to security screening, every part of this will be built to dismantle the coded discrimination that's been normalized for decades." He paused, letting the moment breathe. "We will replace assumptions with accountability. We'll replace exclusion with infrastructure. And we'll make it so good, they'll have to follow." Ava nodded, her voice low. "And if they try to stop us?" "They can't stop what's already imagined," Elias replied. He meant it literally. Neville Goddard had once written, "You rise to a higher level of consciousness not by pushing against the world you see, but by assuming the world you desire is already real." Elias lived in that assumption daily. His vision wasn't a goal. It was a state, a frequency that shaped meetings, dictated strategy, selected allies. Everything happening now, the public collapse of Aero Sky, the collective reflection erupting across the aviation industry, was the outer world synchronizing to an inner shift he had already committed to years ago. In one corner of the room, a small group of engineers quietly reviewed specs for a new boarding process algorithm, one that removed subjective judgment from gate agents entirely. Another table was discussing a biometric security protocol that couldn't be influenced by racial profiling. Meanwhile, Marlon scrolled through a cascade of emails and messages flooding in from other airlines, regulators, activists. Some were offers to collaborate, others veiled threats. One email from a high-level FAA executive warned of concerns around centralized influence. "They're afraid," Marlon said. Elias turned from the screen. "They should be, but not of me, of a world where they're no longer protected by ambiguity." At that moment, a television mounted on the wall began broadcasting a press conference. It was Victor Langford, Aero Sky's CEO, standing stiffly in front of a branded backdrop. His expression was forced calm, his voice dry. We acknowledge the concerns raised regarding recent incidents, and we are committed to a thorough internal review of our policies and procedures. Elias didn't even listen to the rest. He didn't need to. He had read this script 1,000 times, hollow statements designed to pause public anger without shifting a single policy. The camera might have shown a man speaking, but Elias saw the deeper truth. The system was buying time it no longer owned. They still think this is about bad press, Ava muttered. Elias turned off the screen. It's about broken paradigms. He stood, walked to the large glass wall facing the airstrip. Outside, a jet stood gleaming in the sunlight, one of the first prototypes. Not just a vessel of transportation, but of transformation. Behind him, Marlin spoke. You really believe they'll follow your lead? Even the big carriers? Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he recalled a line he'd written years ago in his personal journal, now faded but never forgotten. I am the architect of a system they will one day call inevitable. They already are, he finally said. Because the truth was, he hadn't created New Sky to compete with the existing industry. He created it to make it obsolete. As Neville Goddard emphasized, you don't fight against the old. You imagine the new so vividly, so consistently, that the old dissolves without resistance. And the old was dissolving. One by one, internal memos from Aero Sky were leaking. One showed the quiet rejection of overqualified black pilots. Another revealed unofficial lists of passengers flagged for additional screening, based on nothing more than zip codes and perceived accents. As the documents went viral, the conversation changed. This wasn't just about Elias. It wasn't even just about Aero Sky. It was about all of it. The culture, the structure, the polite protocols that allowed racism to wear a name tag and a lanyard and still be called professionalism. Suddenly, regulators were opening investigations. Civil rights organizations were filing class actions. And on a digital petition titled Support New Sky, over 1 million signatures had appeared in under 48 hours. In a world obsessed with outrage, Elias had given them something rarer, a blueprint for redemption. And in doing so, he was proving Neville's most radical idea. Creation is finished. It is our acceptance of it that brings it into being. New Sky already existed, in essence, in vibration, in expectation. All they were doing now was constructing the material shell around a reality that had already been chosen. That night, Elias stood alone on the rooftop of the hangar, looking out over the tarmac. The city lights blinked in the distance like signals from the future. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Ava. They're asking for a formal meeting. They want to talk terms. Elias stared at the screen. The same board that had once backed Langford without question now sought his forgiveness in silence. He typed one word in reply, no. Because this wasn't the time for mercy. It was the time for momentum. And once a new world has been imagined, it is already on its way. The headlines changed overnight, from scandal to shift, from fallout to future. But Elias Ward wasn't watching. He didn't need to. He had already felt this moment years before, in the quiet dark of his first rejection, in the stillness after his mother's soft warning. Don't ever let them define your worth, son. You define it, and the world will bend. Now the world was bending. But it wasn't bending to revenge. It was bending to vision. Neville Goddard had always insisted. Your world is your consciousness objectified. That truth rippled through every move Elias made, not as strategy but as law. What was happening now was not the result of one viral video, or even $1 billion pullout. It was the echo of an inner world he had curated with sacred precision. While others waited for systems to become just, Elias had become justice itself in motion. By the time the Department of Justice opened a formal investigation into Aero Sky, and the FAA issued emergency audits of all racial discrimination claims filed in the past 5 years, Elias was already 3 moves ahead. He was in the studio, quietly preparing his first public interview. Not a press conference, not a rebuttal, a reveal. The room was intimate, just Elias, the journalist, a camera operator, and the weight of everything unspoken until now. Mr. Ward, the interviewer began, you've refused to speak until now, despite the fact that your story has become a global phenomenon. Why now? Elias leaned forward, not as a man defending himself, but as a man delivering a verdict. Because now the conversation is no longer about me. It's about the system. And I wasn't removed from that plane because of who I am. I was removed because of what they assumed I couldn't be. He paused, letting the silence hang. That assumption, he continued, was their reality. But it was never mine. The interviewer blinked, then asked, "So what is your reality?" Elias smiled, not politely but with the deep stillness of someone who had built their world from within. "My reality," he said, "is one where equity isn't aspirational, it's operational. One where safety doesn't come at the cost of dignity. One where no child ever has to watch their parent escorted off a plane for the crime of existing in a first-class seat that threatens someone else's imagination." He looked directly into the lens, as if speaking to everyone who had ever been questioned, profiled, silenced. "I didn't pull $4 billion out of spite," he said. "I pulled it because we are no longer subsidizing systems that dehumanize." There it was. Not vengeance. Alignment. Neville Goddard taught that you don't change things by force. You change them by embodying the version of reality where they're already transformed. Elias had lived in that version for so long that the old world could no longer tolerate him. And that's why they tried to remove him. Not because he was disruptive, but because he was proof. Proof that the game could be played differently. That a black man could be soft-spoken and still wield thunder. That dignity could be a strategy. That power didn't have to shout. It could whisper and still shift markets. As the interview aired across networks, the public response was seismic. Support flooded in from all corners. Civil rights organizations, Fortune 500 leaders, even former skeptics who now saw the truth behind Elias's silence. He hadn't been hiding, he'd been preparing. Meanwhile, the infrastructure of New Sky was accelerating. Pilot applications soared. Engineers from other airlines sent anonymous resumes. Formerly silenced flight attendants began sharing their stories under the safety of Elias's legal shield. Even customers, ordinary people, began canceling Aero Sky flights, sharing screenshots of their cancellations with captions like, "Building the future with my wallet." Inside the New Sky Development Hub, a mural was unveiled, commissioned by Elias quietly. It featured the silhouettes of black, brown, and marginalized travelers, with one line painted in bold across the top. "The world bends where consciousness is clear." That was Neville. That was Elias. That was now. Later that evening, alone in his apartment, Elias poured a glass of water. Not champagne, not scotch, just water. He stood by the window, watching the lights of the city flicker like neurons in a waking mind. Marlon texted, "DOJ just subpoenaed internal memos. Langford's legal team is panicking." He didn't reply. Instead, Elias walked to a quiet corner of the room. There, beside the framed photo of his mother, sat a worn, leather-bound journal. The same one he had used back in his 20s when Neville's teachings first found him. He opened it. Page 73. "I imagine a world where power doesn't come from the ability to exclude, but from the courage to include. I live in that world now." He had written those words at 2:14 a.m. after receiving another rejection, this time from a board interview where his ideas were too bold. Now that same world was calling him visionary. That is the paradox of change. First they reject you for what they fear, then they rebrand it as genius when it works. But Elias didn't need their labels. He had his alignment. Neville had once said, "The moment you accept the wish as fulfilled, your consciousness is flooded with its reality." Elias had lived that moment years ago. Tonight, he simply stood in its afterglow. It assumed him. Across the world, screens were tuned in. Not because of slick advertising, but because of memory. The memory of Flight 2187, and the man removed not for what he did, but for who he was. That story had become the scar tissue of a wounded system. Today, New Sky would become its healing. Elias made his way downstairs. There were no red carpets, no flashbulbs. Just a row of diverse crew members standing at attention, their eyes not filled with fear, but with ownership. Among them stood Henry Grayson, Ava's father, former pilot, former exile. Now lead consultant for New Sky's ethics and safety program. He looked at Elias, no longer with hesitation but with clarity. "I thought it would take a generation," Henry said. Elias smiled. "It did. Ours." When the doors opened and the first passengers boarded, families, students, executives, elderly couples, there was no pageantry. Just humanity. One foot after another across the threshold into a space that, for once, had been designed with them in mind. Back at the headquarters, the leadership team gathered in the conference room. Marlon stood beside a large touchscreen displaying live flight data. Ava checked in with the social response team, where the hashtags #NewSkyNow and #WeAllFly trended worldwide. But Elias stayed quiet, watching the energy in the room shift, not from corporate excitement, but from a deep inner knowing that they were witnessing something irreversible. Then, a notification. It was a video. A mother and her daughter, black, mid-30s, vibrant, filming themselves on the flight. The child pointed out the window, marveling. The mother looked into the camera and whispered, "My daughter will grow up thinking this is normal." That's the miracle. Elias turned off the screen. That was the goal. Not disruption. Not revenge. Redefinition. Neville Goddard's most radical teaching wasn't about wealth or fame. It was about identity. All transformation begins with an intense, burning desire to be transformed, he wrote. And Elias had nurtured that desire not with noise, but with discipline. The discipline to imagine when no one else believed. The discipline to assume freedom, even while bound by systems that denied it. Now those systems were unraveling, not because they were attacked, but because they had been outlived. In Washington, lawmakers debated new legislation on equity in transportation. In Silicon Valley, tech firms studied new skies screening models, seeking to replicate bias-free protocols in their own onboarding systems. In high schools across the country, young black and brown students submitted their first applications for New Skies Aviation Scholarship Fund, named after Diana Ward and Henry Grayson. But the greatest shift was invisible. It was in the conversations between flight attendants who no longer whispered about ethics behind closed doors. In the private thoughts of young gate agents who would now think twice before assuming a suit didn't belong to a black man. In the quiet dignity of passengers who, for the first time, exhaled the moment they sat down. That was the Neville principle in action. Not spectacle, but shift. Not miracle, but alignment. Late that evening, Elias returned home. His penthouse was silent. The city spread out like a living map beneath him. He poured a glass of water, sat by the window, and pulled out the same journal he'd written in all those years ago. He turned to a blank page and wrote, "It is done. Not because they changed, but because I did." And the world followed. His phone buzzed. A message from Marlon. Flight landed. All systems nominal. Passengers disembarking now. First reviews, overwhelming peace. Elias smiled. He thought of his mother. He thought of 3A. And then, he thought of the final truth Neville had given him. The world cannot change until you change your conception of it. He had done that. Not with protests or permission, but with precision. He had walked off a plane and built a sky. And now it belonged to everyone.